Good morning. Welcome to class together again. We're still studying the life of Moses. Today we look at a very bitter experience Moses put himself through that cost him a lot of his life. When was the last time you got angry? Now, many say, I don't really get angry. If that's you, I think this lesson may be for you. It's for me. In fact, it's a lesson we all need to hear and take heed to. We have a lot of misconceptions about anger. We think of the end of anger, for instance. We think of the raging fire that consumes everything. We see someone screaming at another person. We experience an increase in road rage where someone pulls out a gun and fires at another car. We have people shaking their fists at others in traffic. That is what we tend to call anger. And yet, anger is a much more smoldering heat that breaks out in something that we see in the fire. Forest fires, many times, are started not by some cataclysmic event such as someone torching a forest or a lightning bolt falling upon it, but a single spark in dry pine needles. It smokes for a while, unseen, but that smolder can finally consume acres of lumber, homes, and even lives. Now, people seem to be cool and collected, but that can be a facade because they can still be angry. They just haven't expressed it just visibly yet. But when that happens, it creates some tremendous problems in life. Perhaps you've had some. I have. I'll admit to the fact there are times that I wish I would not have done or said what I said. But I also understand much of that had been building. So let's visit Moses. He doesn't seem like he has an anger problem, does he? But like all humanity and all of us, he has his bouts with anger as well. His life gives us pause about what we feel so deeply at times. So let's dip into the life of Moses and experience what anger looks like from his experience. Anger is, first of all, a human problem. Since the beginning of time, mankind has struggled with the inner life and his anger. We see it really in the earliest parts of the Bible, in the very earliest pages. In Genesis 4, Abel and Cain, the sons of Adam and Eve, offer sacrifices. Now, for whatever reason, Cain's sacrifice is unacceptable. His reaction is to grow irritated, and God notices and he confronts Cain. He says to him in Genesis chapter 4, beginning with verse 6, "The Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it.'" He says that anger in the heart of Cain, unexpressed at this moment, is like a lion crouching in the bushes, waiting for the perfect time to pounce. The image is both vivid and real, as we'll see in Moses' life today. The sin is ready to spring, but Cain can master it if he will. He doesn't. And the result is the murder of his brother Abel, which sets off an entire chain of events through humanity. But let's go to another Bible book, the book of Jonah. Jonah is another instance. Jonah is a prophet of God that God sent to Nineveh, and yet he didn't want to go. He was reluctant. In fact, he refused the first time because he believed that the Ninevites, the Assyrians, were such wicked people, they didn't deserve to hear the message of God, lest they change and God not destroy them. Now, he may have preached change, and they did change, and then God did exactly what Jonah was afraid of. He withdrew the threat of annihilation. So how did Jonah respond? With anger. It says in Jonah chapter 4, "But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, 'O Lord, is this not what I said when I was yet in my country? That's why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster.' Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it's better for me to die than to live. And the Lord said, do you do well to be angry? When life did not go as planned or as he thought it should, he grew angry. Now, don't we? When life doesn't seem to cooperate, doesn't that get a rise out of us? When traffic snarls, when the hold on the phone seems to go on like eternity, when our children fly out of control and the house is a wreck and you're at your wit's end, don't you feel some sort of peak anger, destruction? Don't you want to just break out and tell everybody, stop it? And God asked him a question he really addresses to us. Do you do well to be angry? Is this in your best interest? Does it build your spirit? Are you justified in feeling that God's way should be your way? That's all he's asking you. That's all he's asking us. Anger is an inside fire that burns and smolders until it finally breaks out in some terrible way. It's lit when we feel abused, ignored, or don't get what we expect, especially when those expectations seem petty when spoken out loud. We tamp it down, but it lingers. Anger is the residue of hurt. However, the hurt and the incident that causes it soon passes, and we even forget it. Over time, the reason gets lost, but the emotion grows stronger and hotter. And that's why some marital arguments dredge up the long past that nobody can hardly remember. But the argument is never about what happened. It's about what it means to you and how you are hurt, as we shall see in the life of Moses. Moses has this same issue because anger is not just a human problem, it's a Moses problem. When we look at the bulk of the life of Moses, we see a lawgiver, a spokesman for God, but peeking out of the shadows every once in a while, Moses' life has a smoldering wick, smokes just barely, not quite controlled, then whoom, it flies out of flame. Let's take a moment to look at 3 different episodes of his life right now. First of all, we've already covered 1 and 2. The first is the taskmaster issue in Exodus chapter 2. In Exodus 2, Moses has grown into a man and he wants to flex his power and his agency. He knows his family's story about where he truly came from and what God's promises were to him and his people. With that, all of that, he walks through the slaves' pits one day in Egypt. It says, one day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. Moses saw an act of injustice and decided to intervene. It was something that irritated him. He didn't like it. He was going to stop it all on his own. And instead of simply stopping the beating, he goes to the extreme. He kills the man. Something is prodding at him. He knows what he's doing, by the way, because he makes sure no one sees him. He looks around and makes sure that there's no one witnessing the event. And he assumes no one does, and so he vents his anger and kills the taskmaster, hiding his body in the sands. Here we see Moses flare up. And in fact, the next day, he acts like nothing has come about. He comes across a quarreling pair of Hebrews, and he tries to solve their beef. But that's when they expose him. The fire raged and then died down, but it hasn't died out. We'll see it again when we come to Mount Sinai. On Mount Sinai, Moses spends 40 days in the presence of God. During that time, he receives the law of God, all 613 commandments, with the 10 commandments chiseled on stone, by God himself, in fact. But God tells him in Exodus 32, there's trouble down at the base of the mountain. God says to him, they have turned aside quickly out of the way I've commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now notice in that passage, God doesn't tell them to do anything. But at the base of the mountain, the people have feel fear because they have lost perhaps Moses in the fire of the mountain. And so they resort to this crafted Egyptian idol, a calf, of which they revel and worship. And they ascribe to this golden charm the powers of God himself. And God tells them about it. But then it says that Moses goes down from the mountain and he carries what's very precious. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand. The tablets that were written on both sides, on the front and on the back, they were written. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, engraved on the tablets. He holds in his hands the very carvings that came from the hand of God. These, it says, were the works of God. The writing was God's. Then you see that old friend, that smoldering ember, stirs within him again. As soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablet out with his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. Now I want you to pay attention to a few things here. We read this passage sometimes pretty sterilized. Notice that Moses' anger burned hot. That's what it says. See, it erupted. It now surfaces as a white hot furnace roaring into a high intensity. Nothing was going to stop him. This was exactly the same feeling that he felt in Egypt when he saw that Egyptian beating the Hebrew. Now he was going to take problems. And so in his anger, he does 2 things. First, he breaks the tablets. Now God didn't tell him to do that. Instead, he takes the very gift of God and he treats it like a cheap vase that can be replaced at any time. In anger, people focus only on their rage. They go and they ignore God and all of his gifts and only want to vent their spleen at that point. Then he grinds up the calf, puts it in the water, forced the people to drink it. Moses was going to teach them a lesson. However, God didn't tell him to do either one of those things. He never told him to break the tablets. He never told them to grind up the calf and make the people drink it. That was Moses' idea. It was an act of Moses and Moses alone, not by the will of God. And Moses' anger created a problem. He had the law of God and it was now in pieces. Now, how do you get it back? I find it interesting that God refused to give him another set. Instead, he wanted Moses to learn a simple lesson. So he made Moses do the chiseling on the stone this time. The Lord said to Moses, cut for yourself 2 tablets of stone like the first, and I'll write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. He says it's an act on your own. You cut the stone yourself this time. You go to the trouble. You broke them. And it's like in the China store, the sign that says, you break it, you buy it. That's exactly what God was telling Moses. You broke it. So we're going to have to fix it now, aren't we? When we get angry, we pay a terrible price and life gets a lot more difficult. We pay a personal price. It costs us something. I've known people who put their foot through their wall when they got angry. Now, they had to pay for a repair for money they really couldn't afford to pay. And then around us, everyone suffers when we explode. Families suffer through fits of rage of a husband or a wife. Events get ruined. Trust gets dashed. And after all, we grow more careful and reserved when someone lashes out at us. We step back and we'll never be that close again. One thing to remember, the sin in this instance was against God. But Moses took it personally as a personal affront. It was God's law that had been violated, not Moses' law. But Moses felt wounded. He took out his personal frustrations on others, and that seldom helps. But then Moses will come to a moment, an incident, that will cost him his dream. We have to remember that God told Moses to take the people from Egypt to the land of promise. I'm sure that Moses looked forward to the land flowing with milk and honey. He had brought them all that way. Yet in Numbers 20, all of that would change. It was going to take a lot longer than he thought, because in Numbers 13 and 14, the people of Israel rejected God's command to enter the land. So instead, they are punished with 40 years of wandering in the deserts, till all who had experienced Egypt had died. So in Numbers chapter 20, as they loop around, wandering aimlessly in the deserts of Sinai, and the sand swirling around them, time grows long and fierce and hard. And so they experienced difficulties. And for Moses, this kind of punishment grew a lot more personal. Numbers 20 begins, and the people of Israel, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. I think about what this must have meant to Moses. His older sister dies. It must have been a significant impact on him. After all, it was Miriam who hid in the bushes while Moses floated down the Nile River in the basket when he's a baby. She's the one that approached Pharaoh's daughter and said, I know a wet nurse who can nurse the child. She went to get her own mother, and it was Miriam who seemed to be his protector from the early sages. So now, in Exodus 20, Moses is in a fragile state. I can't imagine what he must have felt like. But the lion crouched even lower in the bushes, waiting to spring. And Moses doesn't recognize his own danger. In the midst of all this mess, Moses has to listen to more griping by the people. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, Would that we had perished with our brothers, perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness that we should die here, both we and our cattle? It says the whole assembly was against Moses and Aaron. They stood there taking it. But most of it was focused on Moses. It was the same song, second verse, we've seen so many times. It would have been better for us to die than be out here. Did you bring us out here deliberately in order to kill us? Can you just imagine what the impact of those darts and those arrows were on a Moses who was already weary, who was already grieving, who was already tired? How many marbles do you drop into the sack until the bottom falls out? You don't know until you get to the last marble. But that last one is terrible. Moses and Aaron go to meet God at the tabernacle. God in all of his glory appears and speaks to Moses. Then Moses and Aaron went to the presence of the assembly, to the entrance of the tent of the meeting, and fell on their faces. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses. He was going to make it clear to Moses what to do. He was going to take the burden off of Moses. He was trying to help Moses if Moses would only allow him to. Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield as water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. God was very specific. Take that staff, that one that you had back there at the burning bush. Get the people, you get them all around this rock. You stand before that rock. You speak to that rock and let the people see that water will flow out of the rock just because you have spoken it, because I have told you to speak it. Simple, right? Not if you're irritated, because that's not what Moses does. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land I've given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy." Moses took out his staff, but then went off script. He began to vent his spleen. He began to lecture the people. He wasn't going to solve this problem inside of himself. He was only going to salve his feelings. "You rebels." And notice exactly what he says. "Shall we bring water out of the rock for you?" It's an act that says, "I'll show you what I can do." And he strikes the rock, and God in his grace gives water because the people need water. It worked. But the problem with anger is it always leaves scorched earth in its wake. God says, "You didn't believe me, did you? And not only that, you didn't uphold me as holy before the people. You didn't treat me the way I needed to be treated, so they would treat me the same way, Moses." Moses failed the basic job God gave him to do. Show the people how to obey me and how to treat God himself. That was the one imperative of Moses' life. And in this case, he failed it, and he failed it grandly. He says, "Moses, you treated me as insignificant." One of the great problems is that Moses' anger elevated himself over God. Doesn't it do that with all of us? Now, it's a small but significant step. What happens when people see Moses treating God in such a way? They're going to do the same thing. "Oh, I can ignore God if I want to. I can do what I want to because God will take care of me one way or another." We hear that today many times. We need to remember that every action we take will teach a lesson to someone else. And when you look at what Moses did, Moses' essential idea was, "I'm going to take care of me regardless of what God says." And that's exactly what anger does with us. I will take care of me. I will make sure I get my just deserts. I will make sure I feel better. And God will just have to wait. So Moses, he says, you won't bring them into the land. Dreams crushed that day into a pile of rubble, because the whole aim of the journey would come up short for Moses on Mount Nebo. We read in Deuteronomy 3, as Moses looks back on these events, that at this time, he tells us he pled with God over this. He said, "Now I pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord God, you've only begun to show your servants your greatness and your mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such mighty works and mighty acts as these? Please let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, the good hill country in Lebanon." The Lord was angry with me because you wouldn't, and because of you, and you would not listen to me. And the Lord said to me, "Enough from you. Do not speak to me of this matter again." Moses' anger had riled up God's anger. See, even forgiven sin bears the consequence of actions. Moses wasn't removed from leadership, but he damaged it completely that day. You see, the problem is the consequence. No matter if Moses continued to lead the people, the consequences of his actions were long lasting, and they always are. Bullets don't go back in guns, words don't get withdrawn. A child who gets hit will never get that pain erased. And sobering to remember that anger leaves scorched earth. I once had a friend who'd been burned as a child. It wasn't a big burn, but it was enough that he had to have a small skin graft. On his hand, it was different. It bore the scars of the healed flesh. It was never going to be like it was. The same thing happens when the fires of rage come to a church, to a life, to a family. Everything changes. But the truth is, we're not looking at Moses. We're looking at the mirror that Moses hands us. Because anger is also our problem. No one person can say that they never said anything out of anger, done something out of pique, or treated someone differently out of irritation. It's such a prevalent problem that James addresses it in his New Testament letter. Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of a man does not produce the righteousness of God. He says you need to be slow to become angry. Cool down, because angry people will never do what God wants them to do. We have in our society what I would call furnace minders. They feed us the news, opinions, speeches, all designed to create anger at our circumstances, to make us feel irritated, demanding, bitter. Yet God says angry people can't do His will. We have to pour cold water on the fire to get the heat out, not have someone stir it constantly. So, what should we remember about anger in our own lives after witnessing Moses' downfall? First of all, I always have to remember I am just as vulnerable as anyone. We all have the same risk. It's part of the human condition. Paul said, beware those who think they stand lest they fall. We always overestimate ourselves. Each one said, I'd never do that. But each one of us is a Moses. I'm afraid that our society today, we don't really pay attention to anger anymore. We just let it fly and watch the aftermath. And then we can always say to ourselves, well, that's them, that's not me. That'll never happen to me. But in any rage-fueled encounter, you can snap, just like Moses standing by that rock with the staff in his hands. Irritated, hurt, trying to maintain control of your world when it doesn't want to be controlled, will always lash out. Don't say, it'll never happen to me. I'm sure that's exactly what Moses thought. But the second is to confront the inner drive. What's driving you? Is it doing the will of God? Because the circumstances may portray that differently. You think about Moses for a minute. Moses was leading God's people. He had gotten the law of God. And yet, at that moment, there was something driving him. That is, I am going to show you how important I am. Moses had experienced years of complaining people. He had suffered the heartbreak of watching the people refuse to go to Canaan and having the rebellion put down. He had gone through revolts by enemies and jealousy by his own brother and sister. He stood by the grave of Miriam in the desert when she died. He didn't know what was going on in his own soul. He wasn't sure. He wasn't available to his inner life. And so his life, whether he liked to know it or not, was out of control. And he wanted, as we all do, to have some measure of control in his own life. And at that rock with that staff that worked once, he proved that he could do something. It's always dangerous when we ignore the fact that there's something pushing us all the time. What's driving you? What's eating you? You know, when you look at King Saul in the Old Testament, one of the things you notice about Saul is he looked like he's so humble, and yet he so needed the approval of the populace. That's why he refused to do what God wanted to do. It would look bad in the eyes of the people. So be aware what's churning underneath the surface of your life, because only then you're going to find your danger points. For you see, Moses was driven. So what's driving you? Is there disappointment, anxiety, confusion, grief, criticism, lack of notice? All of those are fuels that add to the fire, because we all want to say, don't you realize I'm important too? So what's eating you when you grow frustrated and irritated? Notice it, put a name on it, confront it for what the animal, for what it is that's growing inside of you. If you don't know, it will pounce at the worst possible time. And then finally consider the outcome. We all act in haste and repent at leisure. I wonder how many times in the decades before Nebo, Moses must have thought, if I'd have only realized that this would be my punishment. All actions have outcomes. Step back for a moment, consider it. Take a pause. The old advice is really good, it's still good advice. When you're angry, stop and count to 10. Let me add one more thing. In those 10 seconds, let your mind go forward 20 years. What you're about to do happened. Will you regret 20 years from now that this moment happened? If you write that email, if you make that post on Facebook, how much more difficult will your life become? Will you lose friends, alienate church, family, divide churches, destroy your faith? God has given us the benefit of two kinds of wisdom. First, he tells us what to do and what not to do. He tells us. There's a reason for that, and that is to say, here, if you do these things, this will be the outcome of your life. But the other is to let us see the flaws of other people. The reason we study this lesson today is we get to watch Moses strike a rock. Or we go to the New Testament, we see Peter boasting that he'll never deny Christ. We watch David ignoring the subtle signs of growing adultery. And God says, put your name in those blanks. That could be you. Stop, watch, and learn. Many times the best lessons are learned from the worst examples. This could be your future. Heed the warning. Moses must have wished that he could have erased that day in life, taken it, pulled it back, redone it to where nothing would have happened. He would have held his hand steady and just spoke the words, and life would have been different. But instead, this anger that he had let simmer for so long haunted him until his very dying breath on Nebo. And it stands as a warning for us. The anger of a man doesn't work the works of God. That's what you need to find out. It's what Justin Bodine, a 27-year-old man from Minnesota, understood about anger only too late. He was on a bus, and when he didn't like what a 59-year-old woman saw, she looked at him, and he thought she looked at him strange. And so he started shouting at her because he considered what she did was a lack of respect, even though she didn't even know what she did. She grew fearful, so she started dialing her cell phone, called the police, but Bowden punched her in the face. Another passenger tried to stop him. The irony was, he was on a bus to go to an anger management class, But that was not helping him. It was still there. And he was arrested, and he spent many years in jail because the lion was crouching at the door. Moses reminds us of a single idea, one not to be forgotten. The anger of a man doesn't work the works of God. Put the fire out before it burns your life. Thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and I hope you've enjoyed our class and got something out of it. We'll be back again next week as God looks to the future beyond Moses. So thanks for being here. Have a great day. I'll see you again next week.